For those who believe in harbingers of doom, disaster rarely arrives without warning. For centuries, cultures across the globe have spoken of strange omens that appear before catastrophe strikes, phantom ships before storms, black dogs before death, spectral lights before earthquakes. These accounts raise an unsettling question about the spring of 1986. Just what haunted the workers of Chernobyl in the weeks before the worst nuclear disaster in history? The pattern of winged omens preceding tragedy stretches across continents and decades. In rural folklore throughout Eastern Europe, unexplained aerial phenomena and strange creatures have long been associated with impending catastrophe. From the banshees of Celtic tradition to the Japanese yakai, the concept of supernatural warnings woven into human experience transcends borders. But few modern accounts have captured the imagination quite like the events of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in 1966 and 1967. Beginning in November 1966, residents of Point Pleasant reported encounters with a creature unlike anything in the natural world. Witnesses described a figure standing roughly 7 feet tall, with massive wings spanning 10 feet or more, and eyes that glowed an intense crimson red in the darkness. The sightings continued for 13 months, accompanied by reports of disturbing nightmares, unexplained phone calls, and a pervasive sense of dread that settled over the small town. Then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge spanning the Ohio River collapsed during evening rush hour. 31 vehicles plunged into the frigid water below. 46 people lost their lives that day, and the creature, now known as Mothman, was never seen again. The parallels between Point Pleasant and what would unfold nearly 2 decades later in Soviet Ukraine are impossible to ignore. Both communities experienced a surge of unusual sightings before disaster struck. Both reported the same physical description of their visitor, and both would be forever changed by tragedy that, to some, seemed foretold. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant sits approximately 65 miles north of Kiev, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Construction began in the 1970s, and by 1986, 4 reactors were operational, generating enough electricity to power millions of homes across the Soviet Union. The facility employed thousands, many of whom lived in the purpose-built city of Pripyat, just 3 kilometers from the reactors. It was a model Soviet community, modern apartments, schools, shops, and an amusement park scheduled to open for May Day celebrations. For the engineers, technicians, and operators who kept the reactors running, Chernobyl represented pride and progress. The RBMK reactor design was uniquely Soviet, massive, powerful, and unlike anything used in the West. But it also had inherent design flaws that Soviet officials never fully acknowledged. The positive void coefficient meant that under certain conditions, reduced cooling water could cause power to surge rather than decrease, a potentially catastrophic vulnerability. In early April 1986, something began to disturb the routine at Chernobyl. Multiple personnel working in and around the facility reported sightings that defied explanation. According to accounts that emerged years later, workers described seeing a large, dark figure in the sky above the reactor complex. The creature was said to be humanoid in shape, with an enormous wingspan estimated at 20 feet. Most unsettling were its eyes. Witnesses claimed they glowed with an unnatural red luminescence, visible even at considerable distances. The sightings were not isolated incidents. Over the course of 3 weeks, at least a dozen employees reported encounters. Some saw the creature perched on buildings near the cooling towers. Others witnessed it gliding silently through the night sky, circling the plant in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost as if it were surveying the facility. The figure appeared headless to some observers, with the burning red eyes set into what should have been its torso, creating an image that violated every natural law. Viktor Mikhailovich was a senior control room operator at Reactor 4. In interviews conducted more than a decade after the disaster, he described his encounter with what colleagues would come to call the Blackbird. It was April 18, 1986, during the late shift. Mikhailovich had stepped outside the control building for a brief break, standing in the cool spring air beneath the towering structures of the plant. The hum of the reactors was omnipresent, a low vibration that workers learned to tune out. Then he saw it. At first, Mikhailovich thought it might be a helicopter approaching from the northeast. But the movement was wrong, too fluid, too organic. As the shape drew closer, he realized it was unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. The wings didn't flap so much as undulate, creating a ripple effect against the night sky. The creature passed directly overhead at an altitude of perhaps 200 feet, close enough that Mikhailovich could see it was massive, far larger than any bird that inhabited the region. The red eyes locked onto him for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only seconds. Mikhailovich described a wave of cold dread washing over him, an instinctive terror that made his hands shake and his breath catch. Then the creature banked sharply and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reactor buildings. That night marked the beginning of something worse than the sightings themselves. Mikhailovich experienced intense nightmares, visions of fire and smoke, of men screaming, of a darkness that consumed everything it touched. He woke repeatedly in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was approaching. When he mentioned the dreams to his wife, she revealed that she'd been receiving strange phone calls. Someone would ring, she'd answer, but there would be only silence on the other end, or sometimes, a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel. Other workers reported similar experiences. Anatoly Baranov, a turbine engineer, claimed he saw the creature 3 times between April 15 and April 24. Each sighting was followed by vivid, disturbing dreams. Yevgeny Sokolov, a radiation technician, reported waking in the middle of the night with an overwhelming compulsion to leave Pripyat, to gather his family and drive as far from Chernobyl as possible. He dismissed the feeling as irrational anxiety. After all, what could possibly go wrong at a facility with such rigorous safety protocols? Several employees attempted to report the sightings to their supervisors. The responses varied. Some dismissed the accounts as tricks of light or misidentified aircraft. Others showed genuine concern but were powerless to act. What could management do about reports of a winged creature haunting the power plant? The Soviet system had protocols for equipment failure, radiation leaks, and security breaches, but nothing in any manual addressed supernatural phenomena. The testing of Reactor 4's emergency systems was scheduled for late April. The procedure was meant to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough power to run critical cooling pumps during the brief gap between a power failure and the activation of backup generators. It was considered routine. Similar tests had been conducted before. What the operators didn't fully understand was how dangerous the reactor had become under specific conditions. On the evening of April 25, 1986, as the night shift took over and preparations for the test began, several workers reported seeing the Blackbird again. It circled the facility multiple times, its red eyes visible in the darkness. Mikhailovich was among those on duty that night. He later recalled an atmosphere of unease in the control room, an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the upcoming test. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, Reactor 4 exploded. The first detonation was a steam explosion caused by a catastrophic power surge. The massive reactor lid, weighing over 2,000 tons, was blown aside like a bottle cap. A second explosion followed immediately, rupturing the reactor core and sending a plume of radioactive material into the night sky. The graphite moderator began to burn, creating a nuclear inferno that would rage for days. The immediate response came from firefighters stationed at the plant. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik led his brigade toward the burning reactor, unaware that they were running into radiation levels that would prove fatal. The firefighters believed they were responding to an electrical fire, nothing more. They wore no protective gear beyond their standard equipment. As they approached Reactor 4, they encountered debris scattered across the ground, chunks of graphite that glowed with an eerie blue light. One firefighter kicked a piece aside. Another picked it up, noting it was hot to the touch. None of them understood they were holding fragments of the reactor core itself. Pravik and his men fought the flames on the roof of the turbine hall, preventing the fire from spreading to Reactor 3. Their bravery likely prevented an even greater catastrophe. If Reactor 3 had been compromised, the disaster would have been exponentially worse, but the cost was devastating. Within hours, the firefighters began showing signs of acute radiation syndrome. Their skin reddened and blistered. Nausea and vomiting overtook them. By morning, many were too weak to stand. It was during those chaotic first hours, as fires raged and personnel struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster, that several survivors reported one final sighting of the Blackbird. Helicopter pilots preparing to drop sand and boron onto the burning reactor claimed to see a massive winged shape gliding through the columns of radioactive smoke rising from the shattered core. The creature appeared to move effortlessly through the contaminated air, circling the inferno before disappearing toward the north. No one reported seeing the Blackbird after that night. Whatever had haunted Chernobyl in the weeks leading up to the disaster vanished as completely as it had appeared. The workers who had witnessed it most clearly would not survive to tell their stories. Lieutenant Pravik died on May 11, 1986, just days before his 24th birthday. Mikhailovich succumbed to radiation-induced complications 3 weeks after the explosion. Of the dozen or more employees who reported encounters with the creature, only a handful survived the disaster, and their accounts would not emerge until years later, when the walls of Soviet secrecy finally crumbled. The official response to Chernobyl was characterized by delay and denial. For 36 hours, residents of Pripyat were told nothing about the radiation pouring into their city. Children played outside. People went about their daily routines. Only when radiation detectors in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, registered abnormal readings did international pressure force Soviet officials to acknowledge the disaster. Even then, the true scale of the catastrophe was concealed. The evacuation, when it finally came, was presented as temporary. Residents were told to pack light, bring only essentials. They would return in a few days. Buses arrived to transport the population of Pripyat to safety, but the exclusion zone that was quickly established would prove permanent. The city that had been home to nearly 50,000 people became a ghost town, frozen in time. Those seeking alternative perspectives on the Blackbird phenomenon need look no further than the circumstances surrounding the disaster itself. The test conducted on Reactor 4 involved disabling multiple safety systems and operating the reactor under dangerously unstable conditions. The night shift that oversaw the test included personnel who were inadequately trained for such a critical procedure. When the reactor began to surge out of control, the operators' attempts to shut it down actually accelerated the disaster due to a fundamental design flaw in the control rods. In other words, the explosion at Chernobyl was entirely preventable, a convergence of human error, design defects, and systemic negligence. The Blackbird sightings could simply have been a case of heightened anxiety manifesting in unusual perceptions. Workers who were subconsciously aware of safety concerns at the plant may have projected their fears onto ambiguous nocturnal sightings. Large birds are not uncommon in the region. Storks, herons, and even eagles inhabit the forests and wetlands around Chernobyl. Under poor lighting conditions, combined with the stress of working at a nuclear facility, misidentification becomes entirely plausible.
We are deep in the case now. Don't let YouTube bury this file. To keep watching videos like this, you need to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Please leave a comment telling me where you're watching this video from. Now, back to the shadows.
The nightmares and strange phone calls reported by witnesses also have mundane explanations. Nightmares increased during periods of stress, and working at Chernobyl in the mid-1980s, with its aging equipment, occasional safety violations, and demanding schedules, would certainly qualify as stressful. The phone calls could have been technical glitches in the Soviet-era telephone system, crossed lines, or even pranks. The fact that these phenomena clustered around the time of the disaster could simply be confirmation bias. People remember the unusual occurrences that preceded tragedy, while forgetting the many times they experienced similar things without any subsequent disaster. Skeptics also point to the timing of when these accounts emerged. The Blackbird stories didn't surface until years after Chernobyl, long after the Mothman legend had been popularized in Western culture through books and films. The similarities between the two narratives are so striking that they suggest contamination, later witnesses unconsciously molding their memories to fit a pre-existing template rather than recalling events accurately. Furthermore, the Soviet government's suppression of information about Chernobyl creates a convenient environment for legends to flourish. When official records are sealed or destroyed, when witnesses die from radiation exposure, and when the disaster itself becomes shrouded in layers of state secrecy, it becomes nearly impossible to verify extraordinary claims. The Blackbird might be nothing more than folklore that filled the vacuum left by official silence, yet questions persist that resist easy answers. Why would multiple workers, independently and before the disaster, report such specific and consistent sightings? The descriptions match not just each other, but also the accounts from Point Pleasant 2 decades earlier, details that Soviet nuclear plant operators in 1986 would have had limited access to given Cold War information restrictions. The psychological explanation for nightmares and anxiety makes logical sense, but it doesn't account for the timing. Why would these symptoms suddenly intensify in the weeks immediately before an unforeseeable accident? There's also the matter of what happened to the witnesses themselves. Of those confirmed to have reported Blackbird sightings, the mortality rate is strikingly high. While many Chernobyl workers died from radiation exposure, the concentration of casualties among those who claimed encounters with the creature exceeds statistical probability. Is this merely tragic coincidence, or does it suggest these individuals were in specific locations where radiation exposure was maximized? Positions that perhaps also offer the vantage points from which a real creature might be observed. Official records from the Soviet investigation into the Chernobyl disaster make no mention of unusual sightings or phenomena preceding the explosion. But Soviet records also initially denied the severity of the accident, understated casualty figures, and concealed design flaws that contributed to the disaster. The absence of official documentation proves little when the system itself was built on suppression and misdirection. The parallels to Point Pleasant remain the most compelling aspect of the Chernobyl accounts. Two different locations, nearly 20 years apart, separated by the Iron Curtain, yet sharing remarkably similar experiences. Winged creatures with glowing eyes, psychological disturbances among witnesses, and catastrophic disasters that claimed dozens of lives. Either this represents an extraordinary coincidence, a case of cultural contamination and false memory, or something genuinely anomalous that science has yet to explain. What we're left with is a question that may never be definitively answered. The workers of Chernobyl who witnessed the Blackbird are gone, taking their first-hand accounts with them. The plant itself remains entombed in concrete and steel, surrounded by an exclusion zone that will remain dangerous for thousands of years. The forests and fields where the creature was reportedly seen have been reclaimed by nature, creating a post-apocalyptic ecosystem where radiation levels still exceed safe limits. Those who believe the Blackbird was real point to the specificity of the accounts and the tradition of harbinger entities across cultures. They argue that some phenomena exist at the edges of human understanding, manifesting before disasters as warnings that our rational minds are equipped to dismiss, but our instincts recognize as genuine. The creature in this view was neither angel nor demon, but something else entirely, an anomaly drawn to places where the fabric of normal existence was about to tear. Skeptics counter that the human mind is an engine of pattern recognition, sometimes finding connections where none exist. The Blackbird, they insist, is a myth that emerged from trauma, a way for survivors and observers to impose meaning on senseless tragedy. It's easier to accept a supernatural warning than to confront the reality that preventable human failures killed dozens and contaminated hundreds of thousands of square miles. Whether it marks a genuine mystery or a psychological phenomenon born from disaster, the silence surrounding the Blackbird of Chernobyl may be the most telling clue of all. In a world increasingly explained by science and reason, some stories resist easy categorization. They linger at the boundaries of the known, challenging our assumptions about what is possible and what remains forever beyond our understanding. The question isn't whether we believe such creatures exist, but whether we're willing to acknowledge that not every mystery yields its secrets to investigation, and not every warning is heard until it's too late.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.